the difference between democracy and liberal democracy. So, what is the difference? What is the difference between democracy versus liberal democracy? So imagine that you have a country. Let's say, I don't know, let's consider a country, country X, right? And let's say country X is democracy, right? It's a problem. Suppose that in this country, they are a democracy, and democracy is, for the moment, considered democracy to be just being able, that democracy is power from the people. That means that there is voting, and that, whatever policy X there is, or policy Y there is, um, you have all these people going to the ballot box to vote. And let's say that for a policy or bill, policy X, all the people in this country, they vote for policy. They got, like, let's say 51% majority vote for policy X. All right. But in this policy X, it's gonna strip the rights of, let's say policy X is about stripping the rights of the rest of the, let's say 49%. Now you have a situation where a country X can vote a policy into existence that strips the rights, let's say the freedom of speech, or the freedom of life, right? Or economic security, against the remaining 49%, the 49% that is of the population. Now you have a situation where it seems like a country can have can be a democracy, yet in some sense it's not free. It's not free for the 49% that is stripped of their rights of, let's say, freedom of speech, for example. So in this example, democracy is not free. It's not free for the 49% that is stripped of their rights. Another example is in the case of Germany, right? Germany and Hitler. Germany, in the case of Hitler, Hitler was voted into being, like, through a democratic process. But once Hitler was voted into office, right, he institute policies that are stripping the rights of, say, the minority group of Jews, right? So once Hitler was elected, right, he tries to kill the Jews. He kills Jews, and I would imagine that rights to life is a very basic right. So he is stripping the rights of the Jewish people for life, of their life. So stripping the rights of Jewish people of their life. So in this, like, this is another case where you can have a democracy, but yet no freedom. In this case, freedom of life. Life. So we now have a situation where, okay, so a country can be a democracy, yet there is no freedom, or there is a strip of certain rights, like the freedom of speech. In the case of Germany's electing Hitler into being, that strips the rights of Jewish people of their basic freedom, namely the freedom of life. So, so in this two examples, freedom, democracy doesn't always equate or equal to freedom, right? So today we're gonna look at the difference between democracy. So mission. We're gonna look at the difference between democracy and liberal democracy. What is democracy really is, and what is liberal democracy, and what is liberal democracy seeks to solve compared to democracy. So maybe, okay, so why don't we start with what is democracy? What is democracy? Basic idea is majority rule. People vote, and the majority wins. It emphasizes participation. Everyone gets to vote, and it has a huge element of elections. So I always like the word, like always like the phrase power from the people. You know, power from the people. Um, the popular wins, right? Power from popular. What is who is popular? So a historical example would be the ancient Athens. Ancient Athens. In this in ancient Athens, all the people was able to vote. The citizens are allowed to vote. Citizens are allowed to vote directly. But women and slaves have no rights. So in this situation in ancient Athens, everyone gets to vote, but there is no rights for women and slaves. So you could have policies where everyone can vote, but the thing is, these policies or these bills or these laws could be enacted that, let's say, you know, um, strip the rights of, say, slave or women, or um, that women cannot go out without a man uh, present, or slaves have to wear a necklace or something to indicate their slave, indicate who they are. So these are what I mean by rights, like certain rights like life, freedom. So so ancient Athens is definitely a democracy in the sense that everyone gets to vote, but then there's no built-in protection against these, democracy, because there's no way to preserve the rights of women or slaves. So you can have democracy, but not, but you don't have to. but certain demographics don't have certain rights, right? So you could have a democracy where you vote in a certain way, but you're stripping the rights of the minority groups in the society. So what is liberal democracy? It plays liberal democracy adds limits to power and protect individual rights. So this is important because, again, as we said before, you could have a society where it's a complete democracy, but um, you could the majority in that society could institute policies that fundamentally say strip the rights of its minority groups or maybe kill a minority, and that does happen in history. So a liberal democracy have certain would say that there are certain rights that are not questionable, that you cannot use voting to say kill off a certain minority groups or um, strip the rights of black people or Asian people. So liberal democracy also have built on rule of law. So democracies cannot challenge the rule of law. So you cannot have, like, let's say the voting mechanism cannot be such that if the majority say, like the 51% of the people say, well, let's strip up all the rules of law. Well, no, the rights, the rule of law itself is a right, and cannot be, and you cannot challenge the rule of law through the mechanism of voting. You cannot, let's say, uh, ban independent courts. So a liberal democracy has rule of law and has independent courts and constitutions. Independent courts and constitutions. Democracy, you cannot have a situation where the popular majority say ban the courts and kill off all the judges uh, or dismiss with the constitution, because the court system, the constitutions are liberal institutions, and in a liberal democracy, you know, democracy the voting mechanism cannot do away with the courts and constitutions. In any liberal democracy, there is rights to protect minority from majority abuse. From majority abuse. So you cannot have a situation where the majority vote a minority to death. Or in the case of the United States, there is a situation historically where the majority does vote, um, does hurt the rights of a minority groups, and this is with like the Japanese internment during World War II. So you can have so what are some of the countries that are liberal democracies in the modern day? modern day. They are the U.S., of course, and Germany. But again, as I said before, the U.S. During World War II suspends the rights of Japanese Americans. In that situation, democracy trumps the rights of Japanese Americans, because the U.S. put the Japanese Americans at that time into the internment camp. This strips the Japanese Americans of their rights to safety and freedom, or freedom of movement, or yeah, etc. So what are the key difference between democracy and liberal democracy? So when it comes to rule of law, rule, right? Democracy versus liberal democracy is that in a democracy, majority vote or rule. In a liberal democracy, there is a guardrail against majority rule, majority vote. So is majority rule plus constitution. When it comes to rights, in a pure democracy, is not guaranteed. But in a liberal democracy, rights are protected. How about checks on power? So checks on power. In a democracy, it is optional. But in a liberal democracy, is required. What do I mean by checks on power? It means that no single person or no single institution in a liberal democracy can impose their way on the rights of everyone, right? There is checks and balances. In the United States, the checks and balances, the power is being divided between the executive branch, the legislative branch, the Congress, and the courts. So that there's in the case of the United States, there's the three branch of require in the U.S. There is the three branch of government, three branch of government that share power, that share power. So basically, liberal democracy is really um, dark, right? Because you could have, because human beings fundamentally could be have dark. There's a certain darkness, right, in humans, right? Because you could have a situation where the majority just want to, commit genocide on a minority group. So liberal democracy is invented or innovated on top of democracy, and say that, well, it's not just the majority rule, is that majority rule plus there are limits to the majority rule, like namely liberalism. Like there's constitutions, there's institutions like Congress, there is the division of power that limits that freedom, that complete majority. Sorry, the limits the majority rule. And this is really to protect against the tyranny of the majority, right? So liberalism, liberal democracy is invented to solve the problem of the tyranny of the majority. Liberal democracy is invented to solve the problem of the tyranny of the majority. So, a good way to think about it is by analogy, right? Analogy. If democracy is a car, now liberal democracy is a car with seatbelts. You can't vote your way against the rights of a minority group. You can't vote your way against the rights of a minority. So even if you're popular, you cannot kill the unpopular. I think this is an important distinction because it goes against its common misconception we have is that common misconception is that democracy equals to freedom. There are plenty of examples in history where democracy means stripping the rights of certain minority groups. Think about the blacks, right? During the in the 19th century, or the Indian Americans. So in that case, in those situations where there is democracy, but that democracy is about the majority stripping the rights of the minority groups in the United States, like blacks, Asians, and Indians. So not always. So democracy doesn't equal freedom. All right. Uh, countries. The second misconception is that countries can hold election, but still violate rights. So to recap, democracy is about who gets to decide what, while liberal democracy is about what can and can't be decided. Liberal democracy puts in certain guardrails against democracy, in a sense that there are institutional mechanisms like the balance of power, the three branch of government, the constitution, so that you don't have a situation where a majority rule or majority vote can strip the rights of a minority or the unpopular. You cannot kill people that you don't like just because you're a democracy. So next time, when you hear that someone say democracy, you should ask them what kind of democracy, not just democracy. You want to know what kind of democracy. Who is protected under that democracy? Thank you.